To this point in Christology, we've looked at Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the four canonical Gospels. We've also looked at Peter, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Thomas, non-canonical Gospels. We've looked at the ecumenical councils, Nicaea, Chalcedon. We've looked at modern Christologies, feminist Christologies, Black Christologies, liberationist Christologies, and we've looked at Jesus in film. So the last thing we're going to do is we're going to return to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and some other things. And we're going to ask, is there anything modern historians and modern history and the method of historical criticism can add to trying to better understand who was Jesus? Is there anything historians can do to help us answer that question from Jesus? Who do you say that I am? So in this lecture and the two that follow, that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be specifically asking questions about history and about the historicity of, in particular, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And so as I said, to this point, when we've studied the Gospels, both the canonical Gospels and the non-canonical, our entire purpose has been to appreciate each work as a piece of literature in its own right. In other words, we look at this literature and say, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, even Thomas and the Gospel of Peter have a distinct portrayal of Jesus. What we've not done is ask a much more historical kind of question. And that is, what can we say about Jesus himself? What did he actually say, and what did he actually do? If we were trying to find the one Jesus, somewhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, for instance, who is he? So as we move beyond looking at the Gospels as literature into examining how they can be used as historical sources for the life of Jesus, we face another issue. And that issue is this. Given that there are different Gospels which portray Jesus differently, and that all the Gospels embody traditions that have been more or less altered in the course of their transmission, is there a way, historically, to get behind the distinct portrayals of Jesus, to see what Jesus himself was really like? And modern historians would tell you there's a way. It's not 100% foolproof, but there is a way. So the goal of this lecture and the next two are to consider our accounts of Jesus not as literary products that are trying to convey a theological message about Jesus, but to start talking about them as ancient historical sources. And much of the methodology, much of the things I'm going to talk about here, you can apply to any ancient text and any ancient individual. So we're going to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, particularly those four, as historical sources which may or may not be useful for the task of reconstructing a historical Jesus. And then we're going to see, how does that answer the Christological question of who is Jesus, or who do you say that I am? Now, one place to begin any attempt at reconstructing a historical Jesus or the life of Jesus is by asking a basic question that all historians would ask. Are there any sources outside the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, that might be useful in this task of reconstructing the historical Jesus? It might be useful, for example, to see not only what believers said about him, but also what non-believers said about him. To see not only how his friends, his followers understood him, but also how his enemies understood him. And so for the purposes of what we're doing here, we might divide the ancient sources that we have into three different groups. The first group would be texts coming from pagan authors By pagan, I mean Greek and Roman authors. Pagan is a term that ancient historians use that simply means authors that are not Jewish and not Christian. It doesn't mean they're part of a modern pagan religious cult or anything like that. And then we would look at Jewish authors, texts written by Jewish authors, and then texts written by other Christian authors. Because our concerns are strictly historical, we can probably restrict our search to sources written within 100 years of Jesus' death. That is, we would restrict our search to texts and authors between the years 30, Jesus' death, to 100 years later, 130, into the early part of the 2nd century. Anything before that, anything after that, it becomes complicated, and it may be helpful, but not for our purposes right now. So if we start with the pagan texts, the Greek and Roman texts, what we find out is that our surviving pagan sources are virtually of no help if we're trying to reconstruct the life and the teachings of Jesus. Now, this is somewhat odd if you think about it, because given the effect that Jesus has had on history ever since his death, people that start looking for information about Jesus in Greek sources and Roman sources usually expect that his life had an enormous impact on the society of his day, that it would have affected Greeks, Romans, the Roman Empire, you name it. People often think that, well, Jesus is so important, his life and death must have been like a comet striking the earth. But if the historical record is any indication on this, Jesus scarcely made any impact at all on the society of his day. It was less like, if you will, a comet striking the earth than a stone being tossed into the Atlantic Ocean. It just didn't really make that much of an impact. In fact, there are some historians that have pointed out that there were likely more followers of John the Baptist for a period of time than there were followers of Jesus. From the 1st century itself, we have hundreds of documents written by all kinds of Greek and Roman authors, written for all kinds of reasons. Among all these surviving sources, Jesus is never mentioned. He's not mentioned by any of the Greek and Roman philosophers, the poets, historians, or scientists. He's not named in any of the private letters that circulate from this period, or any of the public inscriptions, of which there are thousands. He's not mentioned in any of the papyri that we know. I mean, to put this into perspective, we have no birth records, no trial reports. We don't have any death certificates pertaining to Jesus. We have no reference of any kind in 1st century pagan texts to Jesus' name. He's just not there. The earliest record, or records I should say, that we have referencing Jesus in pagan sources doesn't come from the 1st century. It actually comes from the early 2nd century, which historically tells us it took a long time for Christianity to become important, for it to develop, for people like the Romans to even take notice of it. There's not many, but there are 2, and only 2, certain references from within our prescribed time limits, 30 to 130. That makes some mention of Jesus. The Roman governor of the province of Bithynia Pontus, which is in modern-day Turkey, a man named Pliny the Younger, mentions Jesus in a letter written to his emperor, the Emperor Trajan. This took place around the year 112. Pliny the Younger, in his letter to Trajan, mentions a group of Christians who are followers of the Christ. And he says they worship the Christ as if the Christ is a god. This is actually letter 10 to the Emperor Trajan. If you'd like to read the whole thing, you can Google letter 10 to the Emperor Trajan from Pliny the Younger, and you should find an English copy of that letter online, an English translation of it online. The second reference that we have comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who gives us a lengthier reference in his History of Rome called the Annals, written around 115. In the Annals, Tacitus discusses the torching of the city of Rome by the Emperor Nero, which occurred in the year 64. And in this reference, Tacitus mentions the Christians as the hatred of the human race and says that they were followers of the Christ, who, he notes, was crucified under the governor or procurator of Judea, a man named Pontius Pilate, when Tiberius was the emperor. Now, neither of these references, the letter to Trajan or Tacitus in the Annals, neither of these references tell us anything that we didn't already know, particularly from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And in the 2nd century, in our time period, 30 to 130, there are no other certain references to Jesus in any Greek or Roman author within a century of his death. They just don't exist. And even if you go back and look at the letter to Trajan from Pliny or the writings of Tacitus, you realize even in the early 2nd century, the Christians just weren't that important to the Romans. If we turn to the surviving Jewish sources, we might expect to find more. And we do find a bit more, but not nearly as much as we would like or expect to find. The surviving Jewish sources, things like the Dead Sea Scrolls, some of the apocryphal literature, some of the Jewish apocalyptic texts, even though there's a lot of it, really, it's of little use in reconstructing the life of Jesus. The main source for the history of Palestine in this period is the writings of a man named Flavius Josephus. It would be great if Jesus appeared somewhere in the Dead Sea Scrolls, or if Jesus appeared in all of this apocalyptic Jewish literature that's out there, but he just doesn't. So we really have to rely on this guy Josephus, and I'll explain who Josephus is and explain why we even mention Josephus and the historical Jesus here in a moment. Josephus was a Jewish aristocrat who during the Jewish revolt, the first Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire, which occurred between the years 66 to 70, Josephus served as a general of the Jewish troops in the northern part of Israel that, ironically, Jesus was from, a region called Galilee. When he and his troops were surrounded, he agreed to a suicide pact, and this is going to sound like a very strange story. He agreed to a suicide pact when he and his friends were surrounded by the Roman army, in which lots would be drawn to see who would kill whom until the final two left would take their own lives. And what they were doing here is trying to avoid the prohibitions in the Jewish law against suicide. So only two would end up committing suicide. Josephus tells us that he drew one of the final two lots, but being the diplomat that he was, he persuaded his remaining companion to surrender with him. Later in the war, Josephus was used by the Romans as an interpreter to convince other Jews to surrender to the Romans. And after the war, because of his loyalty to Rome, he was rewarded for his efforts by being appointed as a court historian in the city of Rome under an emperor named Vespasian. Now, a lot of people And you're probably thinking the same thing, that just Josephus guy sounds like a scoundrel, and that's probably true. He was certainly out for himself. But he produced a lengthy account of the Jewish wars about 20 years, and about 20 years later, he wrote a 20-volume work on the history of the Jews from Adam and Eve on down to his own time, called the Jewish Antiquities. So if we're trying to understand Jewish history, particularly Jewish history that's contemporaneous, or a Jewish historian writing who's contemporaneous with Jesus and the New Testament writers, you go to Josephus. And in fact, if you're wondering, yes, you can go over to Barnes & Noble or to Amazon.com and buy English copies of the Jewish Wars and the Jewish Antiquities. Well, Jesus is never mentioned in the Jewish Wars, but he makes two important, tantalizing, but brief appearances in the Jewish Antiquities. Now, the briefer of the two references simply tells us that he was called by some, and that's the key word that Josephus uses, that some people called him the Messiah, and that he had a brother named James. Again, this doesn't tell us anything we didn't already know from Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. There's a longer reference, though, which comes from Book 18 of the Antiquities, which gives us a lot more detail. And this reference indicates that Jesus was known to be a wise man who did miraculous deeds. Josephus also says he had a following among both Jews and Greeks. This reference adds that Jesus was brought up on charges by the Jewish leaders, that he appeared before a man named Pontius Pilate, and that he was crucified. And after that, his followers formed a community that continued to thrive down to this day. Now, again, there is nothing in this longer reference that we don't already know. One of the unfortunate things in this longer reference is that the manuscript was reproduced over and over and over again in the Middle Ages by a Christian scribe, maybe a couple of scribes, who added things to it. If you ever have a chance to read this longer reference in Josephus, it becomes pretty clear that Josephus is not a follower or believer in Jesus, but the additions to this reference, which were made by a Christian scribe, try to make it look as if Josephus was a believer in Jesus. So all we know, if we take what the reference originally was, it simply confirms the existence of Jesus, and it basically coincides with the gospel accounts of him. So it's kind of little use if we want to know any of the details of what Jesus said and did. It just tells us basic things we already knew about Jesus. And again, I want to point out that if a major Jewish historian is writing the history of the Jewish wars and writing the history of the Jews from Adam and Eve down to the latter part of the first century, Jesus obviously wasn't that important. He pops up in a couple of places and that's it. But so does John the Baptist, and so does Jesus' brother James. So lastly, we turn to Christian sources. And you should see a pattern developing here. I mean, there is more information in these sources than in the pagan sources and the Jewish sources, but they're not of much help. If we turn to the Gospels outside the New Testament, like Peter and Thomas, we've already seen that they're way too late to be of much use to us, and they're full of legendary materials, mythic materials. What's really surprising to a lot of people is that when we turn to the New Testament outside of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, in the book of Acts, if we go to the writings and letters of Paul, the life of Jesus is scarcely mentioned outside of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. In fact, the sayings of Jesus are almost never mentioned. The Apostle Paul, St. Paul, who is far more concerned about faith in Jesus' death and resurrection, says little to nothing about the details of his life, nor does Paul spend any great amount of time quoting sayings from Jesus. To put this in perspective, the total information about Jesus in the New Testament outside of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John would fit on a 3x5 index card. The results of that are that if we want to know about what Jesus said and did, mainly we use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and on occasion scholars will use Thomas, but critically and carefully they'll use Thomas. Now, as we've already seen, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John are problematic, especially if we want to use them to reconstruct what Jesus did and what Jesus said. Just to refresh your memory, these are texts that were written 35 to 65 years after the events they narrate. The authors were not eyewitnesses to these events. They appear to have acquired their stories from oral traditions that had been in circulation for decades. The traditions were changed, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. To remind you of an example of this, John, the latest gospel, Mark, the earliest gospel, do not have Jesus dying on the same exact day. That's impossible to reconcile historically. Sometimes these authors even went so far to change the traditions, the very traditions they inherited. We saw this briefly in talking about Matthew and Luke's modifications of this Q document. Luke quotes from this Q document and says, "Blessed are the poor." Matthew turns around and says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit." The evidence for these changes is not just that, but the fact that the Gospels contain accounts that are just irreconcilable in places. And again, there is a whole course here at Albertus that you could take that would go through this, called the Gospels. There's another one you could take called the Historical Jesus that goes much more in depth on this. I mean, sometimes it's so simple as one gospel says Jesus went down to Jerusalem and one says he went up. And sometimes it's something much, much more major, like Mark having Jesus die on one day and John having him die on another day. So if these are our only historical sources, and they appear to be relatively late, and I'm going to add to this, they're biased, they're altered, they're inconsistent with one another, and we've only scratched the surface of that. The question becomes, how can we possibly use Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and at times Thomas, to reconstruct what Jesus was really like, and to reconstruct what he said, or what he might have been like and what he might have said? And one side of this is just simply to say it's impossible and just forget it, which is what some people do. But the other side of this, I think, is a bit more helpful. Most historians of early Christianity, myself included, would agree that although we can't use these accounts uncritically as historical sources, we can use them critically if we follow some historical guidelines, rigid historical guidelines that all historians of ancient history use from time to time. Now, I'm going to get into this a bit more in the next lecture, and I'll show you how some of these methods are used in terms of dealing with the historical Jesus. But what I want to do right now is just talk to you briefly about 3 criteria that historical Jesus scholars and scholars of antiquity use when they're trying to reconstruct sayings and deeds of famous people from ancient history. So historical scholars have devised three major criteria for examining the Gospels as historical sources for the life of Jesus. In some ways, it helps to think, at least right now, of the historian acting as a prosecuting attorney who bears the burden of proof in examining her witnesses or sources to prove her case. The first criterion that historical Jesus scholars used is something called independent attestation. Thinking of this in terms of lawyers, the courtroom, what independent attestation means is having multiple witnesses who independently agree in their accounts. If you have that, that is stronger evidence than having only one witness. If you apply this to the historical Jesus, it works this way. Traditions ascribed to Jesus in more than one independent source are more likely to be historically accurate. So if there's two independent sources or two independent witnesses, that's stronger than one. If you think about this in terms of a car accident, if the only witness is you and the other person in the accident, that's not as helpful as having a large crowd standing around. That can also tell the police officer this is what happened. That's independent attestation. The second criterion is called dissimilarity. Sometimes it's called the criterion of embarrassment, but we'll call it dissimilarity. This is when a witness's testimony is particularly valuable when it works against that witness's own vested interest. So, for instance, if we're thinking about a courtroom, if a witness got up and testified under oath that he in fact did see his best friend committing that crime he's convicted of, that's dissimilarity. This also works in ancient history, particularly with Jesus. So traditions that are ascribed to Jesus that do not seem to advance the interests of early Christians who were telling or writing these stories are valued as historically accurate, because what you would think would happen is you would edit out the embarrassing stuff. And in our next lecture, I'll get into some of this. The final criterion is something called contextual credibility. What this is when a witness's testimony, or I should say a witness's testimony, is discounted if it doesn't coincide with what are otherwise known to be the facts of the case. When talking about the ancient world and Jesus, traditions that are ascribed to Jesus cannot be accepted as historically accurate if they cannot be situated credibly into what we know to be the context of Judaism in first century Palestine. So what I mean by that is, if something ends up in the mouth of Jesus that is not something any Jew living in first century Palestine would do, you throw it out or you assume it's suspect. But if something Jesus says and does fits the context of what a first century Jew would do in the land of Palestine, then you assume there's a possibility Jesus could have said this and done this. All right, so in the next lecture, we're going to get more into this independent attestation, dissimilarity, and contextual credibility, and I will give you some examples of that you can where you can see this working out in the Gospels and even in the Gospel of Thomas.